The first law of the land shall be the king's peace, King Aegon decreed, and any lord who goes to war without my leave shall be considered a rebel and an enemy of the Iron Throne, the writings of Gildane, Fire and Blood, the reign of the dragon. Given its importance to the history of Westeros, when people discuss Aegon the Conqueror and his sisters, Queen Visenya and Rhaenys, they often tend to focus on the conquest itself, which is understandable, but the unification of the Seven Kingdoms is only the first part of Aegon's story and makes up a small fraction of his long and successful reign. Anyone with any care for history will tell you that the work the Conqueror did after all had been conquered is just as important, if not more so, than the conquest itself. Aegon had taken his kingdom with fire and blood, and done what many had thought impossible, but now he had to rule. He had to consolidate, stabilise and unify the realm, whose entire history is that of rise and fall, of war and peace. In truth, an impossible task, but Aegon the Conqueror by far was perhaps the closest to achieving this, with the exception of a handful of his descendants who would build upon his good work. The history books call Aegon's reign the Dragon's Peace, as much of his rule was in fact that, peaceful. But in the year 1 AC, before the Dragon's Peace came a brief period that became known as the Dragon's Wars, that was just as fierce and bloody as any other fought in the long history of Westeros. While the Wars of Conquest were said to have ended in an official context on the day that Aegon was crowned and anointed by the High Septon in the Starry Sept of Old Town, there were still large pockets of resistance all across Westeros, that while posed no real threat to Aegon, would need to be dealt with one way or another. The three sisters were fickle bitches, loyal only to themselves. Supposedly, they were sworn to the Arryns of the Vale, but the Eyries' grasp upon the islands was tenuous at best. The thoughts of Davos Seaworth, A Dance with Dragons Chapter 9, Davos 1. In the Bight, a cold and treacherous body of water between the Vale and the north, the lords of the small islands known as the Three Sisters had taken advantage of the confusion and chaos brought with Aegon's conquest, and were bold enough to declare themselves a free and independent kingdom, with Lady Marla of House Sunderland crowned as their figurehead. It is believed that some of the sistermen thought that the islands were so insignificant in the larger context of Westeros that Aegon would not really care about them, and not waste time and resources trying to claim the islands himself. This understanding is the role of the Septon at the King's Court. Contrary to popular belief, they are not in fact an official member of the Small Council, and more often than not would advise the king and the other lords at court personally regarding spiritual matters of the faith. However, there are many instances we know of where the court septon was included and given a seat on the Small Council in an advisory role. Under King Aegon I, however, we cannot say if any septons did so on these proto-small councils. There are of course exceptions to this rule, however. Many of the septons would often in fact be given roles within the small council, with two in particular, Septon Mermerson and later Septon Bath, who would both serve as hand of the king. In fact, Bath was more than just an advisor to King Jaehaerys, but a close personal friend. It is fair to say all the good work Jaehaerys the Conciliator would do over his long reign would not have been possible without Septon Bath. So while most septons are not officially members of the Small Council, we cannot understate how important their role is at court and the influence they held. We see a lot less septons as close advisors to the Targaryen kings after the building of the Great Sept of Baelor during the reign of King Baelor the Blessed from 161 to 171 AC. With the High Septon moving from Old Town to King's Landing, with the king now able to go straight to the High Septon for advice and wisdom when it came to matters of the faith, thus reducing the importance of the court septon. Needless to say, the sistermen were wrong in that assumption. The issue that Aegon faced was both the royal fleet under the commander House Velaryon and the Arryn fleet stationed in the Bight itself had been badly damaged or destroyed during the conquest, with both sides taking huge losses at the battle in the waters off Goldtown. The king commanded his new Warden of the North, Torrhen Stark of Winterfell, to end the sistermen's rebellion and reclaim the islands. A northern army departed from White Harbour on a fleet mostly made up of Braavosi sail sails, hired by Aegon under the command of Sir Warwick Manderley. But, of course, Aegon would use the power at the core of House Targaryen, dragons. The sight of sails and the sudden appearance of Vhagar being ridden by Queen Visenya Targaryen herself in the skies above Sisterton caused the rebels to lose all heart. They promptly deposed their newly crowned queen in favour of her younger brother Steffon Sunderland, a man who was much more inclined to side with the Dragon Lords. Steffon Sunderland renewed his fealty to the Eyrie, bent the knee to Queen Visenya, and gave his sons over as hostages for good behaviour, one to be fostered with the Manderleys, the others with the Arryns. His sister, the deposed queen, was exiled and imprisoned. For reasons that have been lost to time, after 5 years her tongue was removed, and she spent the remainder of her life with the Silent Sisters, tending to the noble dead. Some speculate this was voluntary penance on Marla's part, others that it was some kind of punishment for deeds yet unknown. Ironborn captains were proud and willful, and did not go in awe of a man's blood. The islands were too small for awe, and a longship smaller still. If a captain was a king aboard his own ship, as was often said, it's a small wonder they named the islands the land of 10,000 kings. The Thoughts of Theon Greyjoy, A Clash of Kings, Chapter 11, Theon 1. Across the other side of Westeros, the Iron Islands were also in abject chaos. House Hall had ruled the Ironborn for long centuries, only to be extinguished in a single night when Aegon burnt down Harrenhal with Balerion the Blackdread. The death of Harren left a power vacuum men were scrambling to fill, and it was inevitably going to turn bloody. Though Harren the Black and his sons perished in the Blackdread's flames, and the main line of the house extinct, Corin Volmark of Harlaw, whose grandmother had been a younger sister of Harren's grandfather, declared himself the rightful heir to the Black Line and assumed the kingship. To be fair, given some of the other claims for power that have manifested over thousands of years of history, at least in this case there was some tangible basis for it. But, as is the case for these kinds of matters, not all the Ironborn accepted this claim. On Old Wick, under the bones of Naga, the sea dragon, the priests of the drowned gods placed a driftwood crown on the head of one of their own, the barefoot holy man Lodos, who proclaimed himself the living son of the drowned god, and was said to be able to work miracles. Other claimants arose on Great Wick, Pike, and Orkmont, and for more than a year, these kings battled one another on land and sea. It is said the waters between the islands were so choked with corpses that krakens appeared by the hundreds, drawn by the blood. This put Aegon in a difficult position. While he had defeated Harren during the conquest, that did not mean he had subjugated the Iron Islands, whom at this stage was still claiming kingship. Aegon would fix this by putting an end to the fighting himself. He descended on the islands in 2 AC, riding Balerion. With him came the war fleet of the Arbor, Highgarden and Lannisport, and even a few longships from Bear Island dispatched by Torrhen Stark. The Iron Men, their numbers diminished by a year of fractured war, put up little resistance. Indeed, many hailed the coming of the dragons. King Aegon slew Corin Volmark with Blackfire, but allowed his infant son to inherit his father's lands and castle. On Old Wick, the priest King Lodos, purported son of the drowned god, called upon the krakens of the deep to raise and drag down the invaders' ships. When that failed to happen, Lodos filled his robes with stones and walked into the sea. To seek my father's counsel, he said. Thousands followed. Their bloated, crab-eaten bodies washed up on the shores of Old Wick for years to come. Afterwards, after all was said and done, the issue arose as to who should rule the Iron Islands for the king. It was suggested that the Iron Men be made vassals of the Tullys of Riverrun or the Lannisters of Casterly Rock. Some even urged that they be given over to Winterfell. Aegon listened to each claim, but in the end decided that he would allow the Ironborn to choose their own Lord Paramount. To no one's surprise, they chose one of their own, Vicon Greyjoy, Lord Reaper of Pike. Lord Vicon did homage to King Aegon, and the dragon departed with his fleets. Greyjoy's writ extended only to the Iron Islands, however. He renounced all claims to any lands House Hall had seized upon the mainland. Aegon granted the ruined castle of Harrenhal and its domains to Sir Quinton Gahores, his master-at-arms on Dragonstone, but required him to accept Lord Edmund Tully of Riverrun as his liege lord. The new-made Lord Quinton had 2 strong sons, and a plump grandson to assure the succession, but his first wife had been carried off by spotted fever 3 years earlier. He further agreed to take one of Lord Tully's daughters as his bride. With the submission of the 3 sisters after their brief rebellion, and the Iron Islands now at peace under its new lords of House Greyjoy, all of Westeros south of the Wall was now ruled by Aegon Targaryen, forming the largest single united kingdom seen in Westerosi history. The key thing to consider here is Aegon almost unified Westeros, save for one thorn in his side, Dorne. So after a brief period of consolidation, it was to Dorne House Targaryen next turned. Aegon first attempted to win the Dornishmen with words, dispatching delegations of High Lords, Maesters and Septons to Sunspear to treat with Princess Mira Martell, known as the Yellow Toad of Dorne, the old and blind ruler and head of House Martell. When first approached by Rhaenys Targaryen during the conquest itself, the princess steadfastly refused Rhaenys' threat of fire and blood, but it was hoped by Aegon she could be persuaded of the advantages of joining his united Westeros. The negotiations continued for the better part of a year, but achieved nothing. Some do question if Mira ever truly considered these negotiations, or if she was just buying time till the inevitable outbreak of war. Dorne is sand and scorpions, and bleak red mountains baking in the sun. Resnac, A Dance with Dragons, Chapter 43, Daenerys 7. It's hard to say when the first Dornish War truly started, but we generally fix the point in 4 AC, when Rhaenys Targaryen returned to Dorne once more. She kept her promise to Mira Martell from the years prior, that this time she would come with fire and blood. Riding her dragon Meraxes, the Queen descended out of the clear blue skies and set the Planky Town ablaze, the fires leaping from boat to boat until the whole mouth of the Greenblood River was choked with burning flotsam, and the pillars of smoke could be seen as far away as Sunspear. The denizens of the floating town took to the river for refuge from the flames. Fewer than 100 actually died in the attack, and most of those in fact from drowning rather than the dragon flame. But first blood had been shed, which is much more than could be said than the invasion attempt during the conquest. Elsewhere, whilst Rhaenys brought fire and blood, Orys Baratheon, half-brother of the Conqueror and Hand of the King, led 1,000 knights up the Boneway, whilst Aegon himself marched through the Prince's Pass, at the head of a huge army 30,000 strong, led by near 2,000 mounted knights and 300 lords and their bannermen. Lord Harlan Tyrell, the Warden of the South, was heard to say that they had more than enough power to smash any Dornish army that tried to stand before them, even without Aegon and Balerion. Dornishmen and Highgardeners had never had great love for one another. Over the centuries, they had fought border wars beyond count and raided back and forth across the mountains and marches, even when at peace. The thoughts of Tyrion Lannister, A Storm of Swords, Chapter 19. In theory, the assumption of the lack of need of Aegon and Balerion would be true, but the issue was never proved, as once again the Dornishmen never offered battle. Instead, they withdrew before Aegon's host, burning their crops in the fields and poisoning every water source they came across. They found the Dornish watchtowers in the Red Mountains slighted and abandoned, with even some burned down, so Aegon could not use them to his own advantage. In the high passes, Aegon's vanguard found its way barred by a wall of sheep carcasses, shorn of all wool, too rotten to eat. The king's army was already running short of food by the time they emerged from the Prince's Pass to face the Dornish sands. There, Aegon divided his forces, sending Lord Tyrell south against Uther Alla, Lord of the Hellhold, whilst he himself turned eastward to besiege Lord Fowler in his mountain fortress of Skyreach. It was the second year of autumn, and winter was thought to be close at hand. Some were eager to return north to ensure the harvest was collected on time, but in truth, many among Aegon's men hoped that once winter came, the heat in the deserts would be less, water more plentiful. But winter, even the most harsh of them, was different south of the Red Mountains, and the Dornish sun proved unrelenting and as hot as ever. All the while, Lord Tyrell carried on his agonizing march towards Hellhold. In such heat, men often need to drink more, and every waterhole and oasis the army found had been poisoned, which meant they had to use more and more of their precious dwindling supplies. First, horses began to die, more every day, then followed by their riders. The proud knights discarded their banners, their shields, their very armour. Lord Tyrell lost a quarter of his men and almost every horse to the Dornish sands, and when at last they did reach Hellholt, he found it abandoned, with not a soul in sight. Dornishmen fight best at home, so I say let us hone our spears and wait. When the Lannisters and Tyrells come down on us, we shall bleed them in the passes and bury them beneath the blowing sands, as we have 100 times before. Tyene Sand, to Doran Martell, A Feast of Crows, Chapter 2, the captain of the guard. Orys Baratheon's attack fared little better. His horses struggled on the stony slopes of the narrow, twisting passes, but many balked completely when they reached the steeper section of the road, where the Dornishmen had chiselled steps into the very mountains itself. Boulders rained down on the Hand's knights from above, the work of defenders the Stormlanders never saw. When the Boneway crossed the River Will, Dornish archers suddenly appeared as ghosts as the column was making its way across the bridge, and its arrows rained down by the thousands. When Lord Orys ordered his men to fall back, a massive rockfall fell and cut off their retreat with no way forward, no way back. The Stormlanders were massacred. Orys himself was spared, along with a dozen other lords who were worth the ransom, but they found themselves captives of Will, the savage mountain lord known as the Widow Lover. The loss of not just his men, but Orys himself, a skilled warrior and commander, was a huge blow to Aegon, whom thanks to his dragon, was not accustomed to taking such serious losses as this. While things were hard for Orys Baratheon and Lord Tyrell, King Aegon had much more success, marching eastward through the foothills, where the runoff of the heights provided water and plentiful game. In the green valleys, he took the castle of Skyreach by storm, won Ironwood after a brief siege. The Lord of the Tor had recently died, and his steward surrendered without a fight. Further east, Lord Toland of Ghost Hill sent forth a champion to challenge the king in single combat. Aegon, ever the honourable man, accepted and slew the man, only to discover afterwards he had been fooled, that he had not been Toland's champion, but in fact his fool. Lord Toland himself was gone, using the idea of the duel to buy time for his escape. Once Aegon eventually turned his attention to Sunspear itself, Mirror Martell, the Princess of Dorne, was nowhere to be found. When Aegon landed atop the Tower of the Sun, he found only his beloved sister and wife Rhaenys there before him, sat on the ancient twin thrones of House Martell, waiting for his arrival. After burning the Planky Town, she had taken Lemonwood, Spotswood, and Stinkwater, accepting obedience from old women and children, but nowhere finding an actual enemy to fight. Even the huge shadow city outside the walls of Sunspear was half deserted, and none of those who remained would admit to any knowledge of the whereabouts of the Dornish lords, and Princess Meera, the yellow toad of Dorne, had melted into its very sands. Queen Rhaenys is reported to have told King Aegon, just as before, during the conquest itself, "You cannot fight a foe who will not meet you in battle." Aegon's answer to this lack of a fight was a declaration of victory, even though now, when we look back, we can see it was no true victory. In the Great Hall at Sunspear, he gathered together what dignitaries remained and told them that Dorne was now a part of his realm, and that henceforth they would be his loyal subjects, that their former lords were rebels and outlaws. Rewards were offered for their heads, particularly that of the Yellow Toad, Princess Meera. Lord John Rosby was named Castellan of Sunspear and Warden of the Sands, to rule Dorne in the king's name. Stewards and castellans were named for all of the other lands and castles the Conqueror had taken. In theory at least, the First Dornish War and the conquest of Dorne itself was now done, and King Aegon and his remaining host departed the way they had come, west along the foothills and through the Prince's Pass. Little did Aegon know at that time this was only the start of a bloody years-long struggle that would come to cost him dearly. In the year 4 AC, King Aegon was marching home from Dorne, having seemingly successfully subjugated it as part of his realm. It very much did appear that his conquest was now well and truly complete. But he had hardly reached King's Landing before Dorne erupted into bloody chaos. Dornish spearmen appeared from nowhere, like desert flowers after a spring rain. The castles of Skyreach, Ironwood, the Tor and Ghost Hill were all recaptured by the Dornish within 2 weeks. Their Targaryen garrison put to the sword. Aegon's Castellans and stewards were only allowed to die after long torment as a form of a message to the Conqueror. It was said that the Dornish lords had wagers over how long they could keep their captives alive the longest whilst dismembering them. However, more modern maesters believe this may just be a case of anti-Dornish propaganda spread by the Westerosi lords to incite and maintain the divide between Dorne, the Dornish and the rest of Westeros. Lord Rosby, whom Aegon had named his Castellan of Sunspear and Warden of the Sands, had a kinder end than most, in a fashion at least. After the Dornish swarmed into Sunspear from the Shadow City to retake the castle, he was bound hand and foot, dragged to the top of the Spear Tower and thrown from a window by none other than the aged, half-blind Princess Mira Martell herself. Very quickly, Lord Harlan Tyrell found himself the only Targaryen loyalist left south of the Red Mountains, but he did still command a sizable host. He was occupying Hellholt, an old and strong castle on the Brimstone River, a place that was well suited to deal with any kind of revolt. But there were issues. The river water was sulphurous and toxic, and the fish taken from it had made many of Lord Tyrell's men sick. The nearby house Corgyle of Sandstone had never submitted, and their spearmen cut down Tyrell's foraging parties and patrols whenever they strayed too far west. The Vaiths of Vaith did the same to the east. When word of the recapture of Sunspear reached Hellholt, Lord Tyrell gathered his remaining strength and set off across the sands at once. He announced his intention was to recapture Vaith, march east along the river and take Sunspear and the Shadow City and punish Lord Rosby's murderers. But somewhere east of Hellholt, amidst the Red Sands, Tyrell and his entire army disappeared. No man of them was ever seen again. Not even the Dornish appeared to know of his fate. From what little we know about the enigma of Aegon Targaryen as a person, it is that he was not a man to accept defeat. The war in Dorne would drag on for another 7 years, though after 6 AC the fight degenerated into an endless bloody series of atrocities, raids and retaliations, broken up by long periods of inactivity, a dozen short truces and numerous murders and assassinations. In 7 AC, Orys Baratheon, Aegon's half-brother and hand of the king, as well as the other lords who had been captured in the Boneway during the initial invasion of Dorne, were ransomed back to King's Landing for their weight in gold. But like most deals with the Dornish, there was a sting in the tail. On their return, it was found that the widow lover, Will of Will, had lopped each man's sword hand off, so they might never again take up sword against Dorne. In retaliation, Aegon himself descended on the mountain fortress of the Wills with Balerion, and reduced half a dozen of their keeps and watchtowers to heaps of molten stone. The Wills took refuge in caves and tunnels beneath the mountains, and the widow lover lived another 20 long years. In 8 AC, a very dry year even in Dorne, Dornish raiders crossed the Sea of Dorne on ships provided by a pirate king of the Stepstones, attacking half a dozen towns and villages along the shores of Cape Wrath, and setting fires that spread through half of the Rainwood. Fire for fire, Princess Mira is reported to have said. This was not something the Targaryens would allow to go unanswered. Later that same year, Visenya Targaryen appeared in the skies of Dorne, and Vhagar's fires were loosed upon Sunspear and Lemonwood. In 9 AC, she returned again, this time with Aegon himself, flying beside her, and Sandstone, Vaith and Hellholt burned. In this war of retaliation after retaliation, the Dornish answer came the following year, when Lord Fowler led an army through the Prince's Pass and into the Reach, moving so swiftly that he was able to burn a dozen villages and capture the great castle Nightsong, the seat of House Caron, before the Marcher Lords realised the Dornish had even crossed into their lands. When word of the attack reached Oldtown, Lord Hightower sent his son, Sir Adam Hightower, with a strong force to retake the castle, but the Dornish had anticipated just that. a second Dornish army under Sir Joffrey Dane came down from Starfall and attacked Old Town. Its walls proved far too strong for the Dornish to overcome, but the Danes burnt every field, farm and village for 20 leagues, and slew Lord Hightower's youngest son, Garman, when the young boy led a sortie against them. Sir Adam Hightower reached Nightsong, only to find Lord Fowler had put the castle to the torch, and its garrison to the sword. Lord Carron and his wife and children had been carried back to Dorne as captives. Rather than pursue, Sir Adam returned at once to Old Town to relieve the city, but Sir Joffrey and his army had melted back into the mountains as well. Lord Manfred Hightower died soon after, and Sir Adam succeeded his father as Lord of the High Tower as Old Town cried out and demanded vengeance. King Aegon flew Balerion to Highgarden to take counsel with his warden of the south, but Theod Tyrell, the new young lord, was most reluctant to be part of another invasion of the Red Sands of Dorne after the fate that had befallen his father. Rather than another all-out invasion of Dorne, Aegon settled for what House Targaryen knew best: fire and blood. He once again unleashed his dragons against the Dornish. Aegon himself fell upon Skyreach, vowing to make the Fowler seat a second Harrenhal. Visenya and Maegor brought fire and blood to Starfall, revenge for the Hightowers in Old Town, and Rhaenys and Meraxes returned once more to Hellholt, where for the first time since Aegon landed in Westeros 11 years ago, a painful tragedy struck, a tragedy at the very heart of House Targaryen. The Targaryen dragons were bred and trained for battle, and had flown through storms of spears and arrows on many occasions, and suffered little to no harm. The scales of fully grown dragons like the Conquerors were harder than steel, and even those arrows that did strike a dragon seldom did enough damage to even penetrate the scales. Most of the time, the dragons never even noticed. But even so, dragons were not unkillable if you have the right tools, a brave man, and luck. As Meraxes banked high above Hellholt, a lone defender atop the castle's highest tower fired a scorpion. It was an unlikely shot given the speed and distance of Meraxes, a shot most certainly impossible, but luck was very much in his favour that day. The yard-long iron bolt caught the Queen's dragon in the right eye. Meraxes did not die at once, but came crashing down to earth, destroying the Tower of Hellholt and a large section of the Curtain Wall. Whether Rhaenys Targaryen outlived her dragon remains a matter of much debate. Some say she lost her seat and fell to her death. Others that she was crushed beneath Meraxes in the castle yard. A few accounts claim the Queen survived her dragon's fall, only to die a slow death by torment in the dungeons of the Ullars. The true circumstances of her demise will likely never be known, but on the balance of probability, most maesters seem to agree she most likely died on impact with Meraxes. Regardless, Rhaenys Targaryen, sister and wife to King Aegon, perished at Hellholt in the 10th year after the conquest, leaving behind a hole in the hearts of her siblings, and her and Aegon's young son, Prince Aenys. The next 2 years were known as the Dragon's Wrath. Every castle in Dorne was burnt thrice over, as Balerion and Maegor returned again and again. The sands around Hellholt were fused into glass in places, with much of it even remaining today. The Dornish lords were forced into hiding, but even that did not save them this time. Lord Fowler, Faith, Toland, and 4 successive lords of Hellholt were murdered, one after the other, as the Iron Throne had offered a lord's ransom in gold for the heads of any Dornish lord. Only 2 of the killers lived to collect these rewards, however, as the Dornishmen took their reprisals, repaying blood with blood. Lord Coddington of Griffin's Roost was killed whilst hunting. Lord Mertens of Mistwood poisoned, with his whole household by a cask of Dornish wine. Lord Fair was smothered in a brothel in King's Landing. Nor were the Targaryens themselves exempt. The king was attacked thrice, and would have fallen on 2 of those occasions, but for his guards. Queen Visenya was set upon one night in King's Landing. 2 of her escorts were slain before Visenya cut down the last attacker with her Valyrian steel sword, Dark Sister. The most infamous act of this bloody age occurred in 12 AC, when Will of Will, the widow lover, arrived uninvited at the wedding of Sir John Catherine, heir to Fawntown, to Alice Oakhart, the daughter of the Lord of Old Oak. Admitted through the postern gate by a treacherous servant, the attackers slew Lord Oakhart and most of the wedding guests. then made the bride look on as they gelded her husband. Afterwards they took turns assaulting Lady Alice and her handmaids, then carried them off and sold them to Moorish slavers, with them likely ending up in the pleasure gardens of Lys. By the end of 11 AC, Dorne had become a smoking desert, beset by famine, plague and blight. Traders from the free cities, who still dared travel to Dorne, called it a blasted and broken land. Yet, true to their words, House Martell still remained unbowed, unbent, unbroken, as Princess Meera had promised the late Queen Rhaenys all those years ago. When one knight, burned and broken, was brought before Queen Visenya as a captive, he insisted that Princess Meera would rather see her people dead than nothing but slaves to House Targaryen. Visenya simply replied that she and her brother would be more than happy to oblige the princess, if only she came out to fight rather than cowering in caves. Princess Meera was an old woman at the start of the conquest when Rhaenys had first tried to take Dorne. Now, 13 years later, she was even older, even blinder, and in general ill health. It was clear to all that she was not long for the world. Thus, time did what fire and blood, the power of a dragon, could not do. In 13 AC, Princess Meera Martell, the Yellow Toad of Dorne, died abed. Some of her detractors, especially in the Dornish marches, like to claim she died having intimate relations with a horse, but there's absolutely no evidence this is reality. The Principality of Dorne passed to Meera's eldest child, Nymor, who became Lord of Sunspear and Prince of Dorne. Given the long rule of his mother, Nymor Martell was already at the age of 66, his health by all reports already declining and failing. The new prince had no taste for war and bloodshed, and no appetite for any further slaughter of his people. He began his reign by sending a delegation from Sunspear to King's Landing to return the skull of Queen Rhaenys' dragon Meraxes and to offer King Aegon terms of peace. He sent his own heir, his daughter, Daria, as the lead ambassador. Dornishmen lie, don't they? They're famous for it, of course. They say the same about us Marchers, so there you are. Arya Stark and Anguy, Storm of Swords, Chapter 43, Arya 8. Peace after so many years of bitter bloodshed, and especially the loss of Queen Rhaenys Targaryen, was always going to be a tough task, and many thought that Nymor's olive branch was all but pointless. The idea of the proposals were indeed met with immediate hostility and strong opinions in King's Landing. Most hard set against them was in fact Queen Visenya Targaryen. No peace without submission, she declared loudly, and her friends on the king's council echoed her words. Most of all, the hand of the king, Orys Baratheon, who had grown bitter and bent after his return from a year's captivity at the hands of House Will, a captivity that lost him his sword hand, and that many of the Stormlords who followed him into the Red Mountains. Orys argued that they should send Daria Martell back to her father with one less hand. Lord Oakhart, whose family had been attacked at a wedding feast, and his daughter assaulted, kidnapped, and sold into slavery, sent a letter to Aegon, suggesting that Daria be sold to the meanest brothel in King's Landing, till every beggar in the city had had his pleasure with her. Aegon firmly dismissed both Orys and Lord Oakhart's proposals. Princess Daria had come to King's Landing under a banner of peace, and would suffer no harm under his roof. It was then that Princess Daria presented the king with a sealed letter from her father. For your eyes only, your grace, Daria Martell to King Aegon I, Fire and Blood, Reign of the Dragon. The reality was that King Aegon had too grown weary of war. All men agreed, but granting the Dornishmen peace without submission would be a tantamount to saying that his beloved sister and wife, Rhaenys, had died in vain for nothing, that all the blood and death had been for naught, the whole war pointless. The lords of his small council further cautioned that any such peace agreement could be seen as a sign of weakness and might encourage fresh rebellions, which would then need to be put down. Aegon knew that the Reach and the Stormlands, and particularly the Dornish marches, had suffered most grievously during the war, and would never forgive nor forget. Even in King's Landing, the king dared not let the Dornishmen outside of the Aegon fort without a strong escort, for fear that the small folk of the city would tear them to pieces. He even had reason not to trust some of his lords and close advisors, given how personal some of the grievances with the Dornish were. Later it would be written that Grand Maester Lucan, for all these reasons, that Aegon was on the point of refusing the Dornish proposals and continuing the war. Just as Aegon was about to dismiss Princess Daria and the Dornish delegation back to Sunspear to her father, Daria presented Aegon with a sealed letter from Maegor. She told the king it was for his eyes and his eyes alone. The king read the letter, sat upon the Iron Throne, in silence in an open court, stone-faced, never betraying any emotion he may have felt. When he finished reading the letter, he rose, a hand dripping where he had been gripping the jagged throne so tightly. He walked to the nearest torch and burned the letter, never speaking of it again. That very same night he mounted his dragon Balerion and flew across the waters of Blackwater Bay to his home of Dragonstone upon its smoking mountain. He returned to King's Landing earlier that next morning as the sun was rising, upon which Aegon agreed to the peace terms offered by Prince Maegor, signing a treaty of everlasting peace with Dorne. Even today, no one can say with any level of certainty or clarity what might have been in the letter from Prince Maegor that had turned the normally unshakable King Aegon so pale and shaken that very day. Some claim it was a simple plea from one father to another, deep, heartfelt words that had touched King Aegon's heart, which does seem unlikely. Others insist it was a long list of every noble lord and valiant knight whom had lost their lives fighting the war. Certain septons even go as far as saying that the letter was written not by Maegor, but rather his late mother, the Princess Mira Martell, shortly before her death, using a vial of Queen Rhaenys' own blood as ink, so the king could not resist the letter's evil magic. A Grand Maester Clegg, who came to King's Landing many years after the events, concluded that Dorne no longer had the ability nor the strength to fight on. Some even believe that Queen Rhaenys herself survived her fall at Hellholt, but was being kept captive in extreme torment in the dungeons of the Ullars, and the Dornish promised to end her suffering should Aegon agree to end the war. Others also believe that, driven by sheer desperation, Prince Maegor might have threatened that should peace be refused, he would engage the famed and feared faceless men of Braavos to kill the king's son and heir via his beloved queen, Rhaenys, the young Prince Aenys, who was only 6 years of age at the time. Whatever was in the letter, we will never truly know. It will forever be a secret between Aegon and Maegor. Thus, after 9 bloody years, the First Dornish War came to an end. Princess Mira, the Yellow Toad, had managed to do what none of the other kings of Westeros had. She had, in the Dornish view, defeated House Targaryen and their dragons. North of the Red Mountains, her name is forever remembered in scorn and disgust for the tactics she had used. The term Dornish courage became a mocking name for cowardice across the whole of the Seven Kingdoms, from the Dornish marches to the wall in the far north. The toad hops into her hole when threatened, one scribe wrote. Another said, Mira fought like a woman, with lies, treachery and witchery. The Dornish victory, if you can even call it a victory, was seen to be dishonourable, and the survivors of the fight and the sons and the brothers of those who had fallen promised one another that vengeance would need to wait for a future generation, and the ascension of a younger, more bloodthirsty king. Though he would sit the Iron Throne for another 24 years, the Dornish conflict was the last war of Aegon the Conqueror. Aegon the Conqueror brought fire and blood to Westeros, but afterward he gave them peace, prosperity, and justice. Daenerys Targaryen to her supporters, A Storm of Swords, Chapter 71. Daenerys 6. King Aegon I Targaryen, Aegon the Conqueror, was rightly a warrior of great renown and reputation, the greatest conqueror in the history of Westeros. He achieved what many thought impossible, the unification of Westeros under one single High King, save for the thorn in the side that was Dorne. While for the most part this is a fair assessment, many believe his most significant accomplishments came during times of peace, especially after the conclusion of the First Dornish War. A common saying often cited in the history books in the Citadel of Old Town is that the Iron Throne was forged with fire and steel and terror but once the throne had cooled, it became a seat of justice for all of Westeros. The reconciliation and joining of the Seven Kingdoms together under House Targaryen's rule was the keystone of Aegon I's policies and politics as king. He needed to ensure this new kingdom was built to last generations and would not just fall to pieces after his death. To this end, he made great effort to include men and even a few women from every part of the realm in his courts and councils. His former foes were encouraged to send their children to court, to the growing city of King's Landing, the heart of this new Westeros. Chiefly, his aim was for the lords to send younger sons and daughters, as most great lords desired to keep their heirs close to home. The boys would serve as pages, cupbearers, and squires, the girls as handmaidens and companions to Aegon's queens, Visenya and Rhaenys. In King's Landing, in the cavernous, smoky Aegon fort, they witnessed the king's justice at first hand, and were urged to think of themselves as leal subjects of one great realm, not as Westermen or Stormlanders or Northmen. But in truth, it would take centuries to unpick such a deeply rooted mindset, and while in time progress would be made, those divisions would still linger to some degree. What has love to do with marriage? A prince should know better. Your father married for love, it said. How much joy has he had of that? Jaehaerys Drinkwater to Quentyn Martell, A Dance with Dragons, The Queen's Hand. The Targaryens also brokered many marriage pacts between noble houses from far ends of the realm, in hopes such alliances would help tie the conquered lands together and make the Seven Kingdoms one. Given the social structure of the former individual kingdoms, most houses tended to marry within their own kingdom. There were of course matches often made with neighbouring kingdoms, but this was far from the norm. Aegon's queens, Visenya and Rhaenys most of all, took a great special delight in arranging these matches. Through their efforts, the young Ronald Arryn, the Lord of the Eyrie, took a daughter of Torrhen Stark, the Lord of Winterfell, to wed, joining the Vale of Arryn and the cold, hard north. Lord Loren Lannister, the former King of Casterly Rock's eldest son and heir, married a Redwyne girl from the Arbor, a match that would come to benefit both houses greatly. When 3 girls, triplets, were born to the even star of Tarth, Queen Rhaenys arranged betrothals for all 3, one with House Corbray, one with House Hightower, and the third with House Harlaw. Thus, House Tarth now had familial connections to the Vale, the Reach, and the Iron Islands. Some of these matches, such as House Harlaw, would more than likely never have been possible prior to the conquest. Visenya too brokered a double wedding between House Blackwood and House Bracken, rivals whose history of enmity went back centuries, matching a son of each house with a daughter of another to seal a peace between them that would be everlasting. While this feat was a true marvel of politics and matchmaking, the peace between the houses would prove to be very short-lived. When a girl of House Rowan in Rhaenys' service found herself with child by a scullion from the kitchens of the Aegon fort, the Queen found a newly raised knight to marry her in White Harbour, and another in Lannisport who was willing to take on her bastard as a fosterling. He spoke truly. It is a monstrous, uncomfortable chair, in more ways than one. Robert Baratheon to Eddard Stark about the Iron Throne, A Game of Thrones Chapter 12, Eddard 2. Though no one doubted that Aegon Targaryen was the final authority in all matters relating to governance of his realm, Visenya and Rhaenys Targaryen remained his partners in power throughout his reign, and perhaps held the most power of any queen Westeros has ever seen, save for the exception of good Queen Alysanne, the beloved sister and wife of Jaehaerys I, whose influence, while did not match Visenya and Rhaenys, came very close. It was the king's custom to bring one of his queens with him whenever he travelled, whilst the other remained at Dragonstone or King's Landing, often as not seated on the Iron Throne itself, ruling on whatever matters came before her. There is some evidence to suggest Rhaenys preferred to travel, while Visenya cared more for presiding over matters at court. Though Aegon had designated the growing new city of King's Landing as his royal seat and had installed the Iron Throne in the Aegon Fort's smoky long hall, he spent no more than 1/4 of his time there. Many of his days and nights were spent on Dragonstone, the island citadel of his forebears, and in his heart, his true home. maybe perhaps Visenya, Aegon and Rhaenys were the last Targaryens to ever truly call the island citadel home, as King's Landing grew in prestige and importance. The castle below the Dragon Mount had 10 times the room of the Aegon Fort, with considerably more comfort. It was safer and had more history. The Conqueror was once heard to say he even loved the scent of Dragonstone, where the salt air always smelled of smoke and brimstone. Aegon spent roughly 6 months a year between his 2 seats, dividing his time equally. The other half of his year, Aegon devoted to an endless royal progress, taking a roaming court from one castle to another, guesting with each of his great lords in turn. Goldtown and the Eyrie, Harrenhal, Riverrun, Lannisport and Casterly Rock, Crakehall, Old Oak, Highgarden, Old Town, the Arbour, Hornhill, Ashford, Storm's End and Evenfall Hall all had the honour of hosting Aegon countless times. But Aegon could and would turn up almost anywhere, sometimes unexpectedly, with as many as 1,000 knights, lords and ladies in his entourage. He journeyed 3 times to the Iron Islands, spent a fortnight in Sisterton in 19 AC, and visited the north 6 times, holding court 3 times in White Harbour, twice at Barrowton, and once at Winterfell, the seat of House Stark, on his very last royal progress in 33 AC. It is better to forestall rebellion than put them down, Aegon once famously said when asked the reason for his journeys. A glimpse of a king in all his power, mounted upon Balerion the Black Dread, attended by hundreds of knights glittering in silk and steel, did much to install loyalty in restless lords. The small folk needed to see their king and queens from time to time as well, the king added, and know that they might have the chance to lay their grievances and concerns before him. And so they did. Much of every royal progress was given over to feasts and balls and hunts and hawking, and every lord attempted to outdo the other in splendour and hospitality. But Aegon also made a point of holding courts wherever he might travel, whether from a dais in some great lord's castle, or a mossy stone in a farmer's field. 6 maesters travelled with him, to answer any questions he might have on local law or customs or history, and to make note of such decrees and judgments Aegon might have handed down. A lord should know the land he rules, Aegon had told his son Aenys. Through his travels, Aegon learned much and more about the people of the 7 kingdoms. Each of the conquered kingdoms had its own laws and own traditions. King Aegon did little to interfere with those. He allowed his lords to continue to rule much as they always had done, with the same powers and prerogatives. The laws of inheritance and successions remained unchanged. The existing feudal structures were confirmed. Lords both great and small retained the power of pit and gallows on their own lands, and the privilege of the first night, wherever that custom had formerly been, prevailed. All this and more truly started to bring the 7 kingdoms together as one. Aegon the Conqueror brought fire and blood to Westeros, but afterwards he gave them peace, prosperity, and justice. Daenerys Targaryen to her supporters. A Storm of Swords, Chapter 71. Daenerys 6. Early into the reign of Aegon the Conqueror, the 7 kingdoms he ruled were still just that. 7 individual kingdoms, many of whom had been rivals for millennia. They were not yet one united realm. Thus, Aegon's biggest concern became peace. Before the conquest, war was just a common part of life in Westeros. Hardly a single year would pass without some form of war breaking out somewhere across the realm. Even in kingdoms that were supposed to be at peace, many of the lords settled their disputes at sword point, in the form of single combat or petty border skirmishes. Aegon's conquering of Westeros and ascension as High King was to, in effect, put an end to all of that, with the concept of the King's Peace. Every lord, no matter how great or petty, every knight, every man, were now expected to take their quarrels and disputes to their liege lord and abide by their ruling and judgments. In cases of arguments between the great houses, any issue would be listened to and judged by the crown itself. In some cases, this would mean the hand of the king or one of Aegon's queens, but more often than not, this meant King Aegon personally. The first law of the land shall be the king's peace, Aegon decreed, and any lord who goes to war without my leave shall be considered a rebel and an enemy of the Iron Throne. The heart of any successful kingdom, its very lifeblood, is trade. A well-managed and booming economy will benefit the richest lord and poorest of small folk. The forming of the Seven Kingdoms gave Aegon a chance to reform the disjointed system of taxation across the realm. Before, each kingdom managed their own individual tax affairs, with the rich generally getting richer and the poor with very little hope of any upward mobility. Thus, King Aegon issued decrees regularizing custom duties and taxes throughout the realm. No longer would every port and every petty lord be free to exact however much they could from the tenants, small folk and merchants. He also proclaimed that the holy men and the women of the faith and all their lands and possessions were to be exempt from taxation, and affirmed the right of the faith's own courts to try and sentence any septons, sworn brothers or holy sisters, accused of any crime. Though not himself a godly man, Aegon always took care to court the support of the faith and the High Septon in Old Town, knowing how vital a strong religion is to keeping his new kingdom together. The faith and the High Septon held much power and sway over the small folk and the more pious lords, while Aegon with his dragons was now the undisputed power in Westeros. If House Targaryen's relationship with the faith was not managed carefully, it could result in tensions within the kingdoms, tensions that do not encourage unity. The Cobblecat's cranky old maester used to claim that he could tell one port from another just by the way they smelled. Cities were like women, he insisted. Each one had its own unique scent. Old Town was as flowery as a perfumed dowager. Lannisport was a milkmaid, fresh and earthy, with some wood smoke in her hair. King's Landing reeked like some unwashed whore, but White Harbour's scent was sharp and salty, a little fishy too. The Thoughts of Davos Seaworth, A Dance with Dragons, Chapter 15. Davos 2. Another key pillar at the very heart of Aegon's new Westeros was his new capital city, a city he wanted to make fit for the kings of House Targaryen for generations to come. At the end of the conquest, a large ramshackled village had grown around the Aegon fort, atop Aegon's high hill. This village quickly grew into the proto-King's Landing that spread around all three great hills and the Blackwater Rush. These three once nameless hills had been named by the small folk for the three conquerors, the tallest, Aegon's High Hill, and the two lesser hills, Visenya's Hill and the Hill of Rhaenys. The crude Moat and Bailey fort that Aegon had thrown up so quickly was neither large enough nor grand enough to house the king and his court, and had begun to expand even before the conquest was completed. A new keep was erected, all of logs and 50 feet high, with a cavernous long hall beneath it, and a kitchen made of stone and roofed with slate in case of fire. Stables appeared, then a granary. A new watchtower was raised twice as tall as the older one. Soon the Aegon fort was threatening to burst out of its very walls, so a new palisade was raised, enclosing more of the hilltop, creating space enough for a barracks, an armory, a sept, a drum tower, while still a modest keep by the scale of the great seats of Westeros, such as Casterly Rock or Winterfell. The Aegon fort only grew in only a short few years, rather than hundreds. The growing town below saw a huge number of wharves, docks and storehouses rising along the muddy banks of the Blackwater Rush, with trade from merchants from across the whole of Westeros, and even as far as the Iron Islands. Even ships from the free cities, across the narrow sea, were sharing docks with the trading vessels of House Velaryon and Celtigar, with both houses benefiting greatly with the influx of extra trade heading in to the Blackwater Rush. The rush itself was so full of ships, accidents had become a common sight. Long gone were the days a handful of small fishing boats plied their trade in the fast-moving waters. Much of this extra trade would have once gone to towns such as Maidenpool or Duskendale, only a few days' sail to the north of King's Landing. Some maesters, and even the rulers of Duskendale, House Darkland, would argue that the loss of trade to a new town so close to Duskendale ruined Duskendale's economy, and as a result, growth slowed, and the once fast-growing town stagnated. Ironically, this very point would one day be a factor into the downfall of House Targaryen under the Mad King Aerys II. when he was mentally broken after being kidnapped during the defiance of Duskendale. King's Landing, however, saw its first fish market spring up along the banks of the Blackwater Rush, a large cloth market between the three hills. With all this new trade, a custom house was built too, to ensure all duties and taxes were collected correctly. A modest sept opened on the Blackwater, in the hull of an old cog that had been there for decades, no one quite sure how long, or even how it ended up on the bank. The first sept was followed by a stouter one of wattle and daub on the shore further upriver. Then a second sept, twice as large and thrice as grand, was built atop Visenya's hill, with coins sent by the High Septon of the Faith himself. Shops and homes sprouted up like mushrooms after rain. Wealthy men raised walled manses on hillsides, whilst the poor gathered in the squalid hovels of mud and straw in the lower places between. The issue King Aegon faced is while his conquest was years in the planning, no one had thought to have planned King's Landing. Some have suggested it was never Aegon's intent to actually found a city on the site of King's Landing, that it simply just grew. But given what we know about Aegon the Conqueror, it does seem wrong to believe it was entirely unintentional. Most learned men agree that King's Landing was part of Aegon's wider plans, but he did not predict that it would grow so staggeringly fast. At Aegon's first coronation in the Aegon Fort, during the initial few weeks of the conquest, it was still a village squatting beneath Moat and Bailey Castle. Even that village had sprung up remarkably fast. By his second coronation in the starry Sept of Old Town, it had already become a thriving town of several thousand men, women and children, calling it home. By 10 AC it was now a true city, almost as large as Goldtown or White Harbour, and by 25 AC it had outgrown both, to become the third most populous city in Westeros, surpassed now only by Lannisport and Old Town. The rate of growth of King's Landing in 10 years and 25 years seems physically pushing the limits of what is possible. Unlike its rivals, the other four cities in Westeros, Goldtown, Lannisport, White Harbour and Old Town, King's Landing had no walls. It needed none, some of the residents were known to have said. No enemy would ever dare attack the city, so long as it was defended by the Targaryens and their dragons. It is possible the king himself might have shared these views originally, but the death of his sister and wife Rhaenys, and her dragon Meraxes in 10 AC, and the following attacks upon his own person undoubtedly gave him cause to reconsider this idea, more so as he and Visenya spent much of their time away from King's Landing, and not just on Dragonstone, but touring around Westeros on royal progresses. If there were no dragons to defend the city, the King's Landing would effectively be defenceless without a wall. Finally, what convinced Aegon was in the summer of 19 AC, word reached Westeros of a daring raid in the Summer Isles, where a pirate fleet had sacked Tall Tree's town and carried off 1,000 women and children as slaves, along with a fortune in plunder. The account of the raids greatly troubled Aegon, who realised that King's Landing would be similarly vulnerable to an enemy shrewd enough to fall upon the city when he and his sister were elsewhere. Accordingly, Aegon ordered the construction of a ringed wall around King's Landing, as high and strong as those that protect Old Town and Lannisport. The task of building them was conferred upon Grand Maester Garwin and Sir Osmond Strong, the then Hand of the King. To honour the 7 gods, Aegon decreed that the city would have 7 gates, each defended by a massive gatehouse and defensive tower. Work on the walls began the next year, and would continue until 26 AC. Now King's Landing was a true city, with walls to rival the likes of the much older ancient cities of Westeros. King's Landing was fastly becoming not just the centre of Westeros, as Aegon had intended, but a home worthy of the last spark of old Valyria, House Targaryen. The Hand of the King was the second most powerful man in the 7 kingdoms. He spoke with the king's voice, commanded the king's armies, drafted the king's laws. At times he even sat upon the Iron Throne to dispense the king's justice, when the king was absent or sick or otherwise indisposed. Robert was offering him a responsibility as large as the realm itself. It was the last thing in the world he wanted. The Thoughts of Eddard Stark, A Game of Thrones Chapter 4, Eddard 1. When Aegon the Conqueror first unified Westeros under his rule, while he did have a close group of friends and advisors, some even with titles such as Master of Ships, there was no official collective in the form of a small council. Some argue that the small council we know today didn't take its final form until the reign of King Jaehaerys I, Jaehaerys the Conciliator, with the prior proto-small councils being a much more loosely connected group. So while Aegon did not have what modern rulers would recognise as a small council, he did have one in a form. As then, as in now, the Hand of the King was always the most important advisor, the one all others looked to. By the end of the First Dornish War in 13 AC, King Aegon was already on his fourth Hand of the King, a well-regarded knight, Sir Osmond Strong. His first Hand of the King, named at his first coronation at the Aegon Fort, early into the Conquest, was Aegon's half-brother and best friend, Lord Orys Baratheon. It was said that Orys was a strong and competent hand, and likely would have served in the role for his whole life, if not for his unfortunate fate during the opening weeks of the First Dornish War. While trying to enter Dorne via the Boneway, Orys and his men were harassed by Lord Will of Will until they found themselves trapped. Orys and his men were taken captive, and Lord Will had the sword hand of every man cut off, so they might never take up arms against the Dornish again. It seems the loss of his sword hand affected Orys deeply, and after Aegon had negotiated his release, Orys was returned to King's Landing, where he asked his brother to be relieved of his duties. The King's Hand should have a hand, he reportedly said. I will not have men speaking at the King's stump. Aegon granted his half-brother this request. He next called upon Edmund Tully, the Lord of Riverrun, to take up the handship. Lord Edmund had been one of the first river lords to come to Aegon's side during the conquest, and had proven loyal. He served in the role from 7 to 9 AC, but when his wife died in childbirth, he decided that his children had more need of him than the realm, and begged leave to return to the Riverlands. Alton Celtigar, the Lord of Claw-Isle, replaced Tully. He served ably as hand until his death from natural causes in 17 AC, after which the king named Sir Osmond Strong. There are some who call my order the Knights of the Mine. Have you ever thought that you might wear a maester's chain? There is no limits to what you might learn. I can teach you history, healing, herb lore. I can teach you the speech of ravens and how to build a castle, and the way a sailor steers his ships by the stars. I can teach you to measure the days and mark the seasons. And at the Citadel in Old Town, they can teach you 1,000 things more. But Bran, no man can teach you magic. Maester Luwin to Bran Stark, A Game of Thrones Chapter 53, Bran 6. Much like in what would become the modern small councils, the role of the Grand Maester is vital in the effective running of the realm. Grand Maester Garwin was the third in this office. King Aegon had always kept maesters on Dragonstone prior to the conquest, as did his father and his grandfather before him, despite at this time House Targaryen not showing much interest in the lands to their west. All the great lords of Westeros, and many lesser lords and some landed knights, relied upon maesters trained in the Citadel of Old Town to serve their household as healers, scribes, counsellors, to breed and train the ravens who carried their messages, and to write and read those messages for lords who lacked those skills. They were to help the stewards with the household accounts, and teach the lord's children. In a way, given how close maesters are to every knight and lord in Westeros, the fact they have the ear of some of the most powerful men make their influence truly indescribable. The maesters even had the confidence and ear of the king himself, with the king often coming to these learned men for advice. During the conquest, Aegon and his sisters each had a maester serving them, and afterward, the king sometimes employed as many as half a dozen to deal with all the matters brought before him. When Aegon travelled his new kingdom in several royal progresses, he always had maesters at his side, including maesters of local lords who knew their kingdoms and their customs well. from their histories to their complex and differing legal systems and laws. But the wisest and most learned men in the Seven Kingdoms were in fact the Archmaesters of the Citadel, each of them the supreme authority in one of the great disciplines. These men would often dedicate their whole lives to becoming a maester of a single subject matter, from the history to music, to medicine, to some archmaesters who still focus their energy on the fruitless pursuits such as magic. In 5 AC, King Aegon, feeling the realm might benefit from such wisdoms, asked the conclave to send him one of their own members to advise and consult with him on all matters relating to the governance of the realm. Thus was the office of Grand Maester created. Jaime watched from the foot of the table, thinking of all those lords who have aspired to a seat on the king's small council. They can bloody well have mine. If this was power, why did it taste like tedium? The thoughts of Jaime Lannister. A Storm of Swords, Chapter 72, Jaime 9. The first man to serve in the capacity of Grand Maester was Archmaester Ollidar, Keeper of the Histories, at the Citadel of Oldtown. The king had no say in whom the Grand Maester would be, leaving it to the conclave of maesters to choose the most suitable man. While most maesters are apolitical, some had better working relationships with their king than others. But the role of maester was one many respected, even kings. Though exceptionally learned, Ollidar was also exceptionally old, an issue that would plague the selection of many Grand Maesters. Thus, he passed from this world in less than 6 months after taking up the mantle of Grand Maester. To fill his place, the conclave selected Archmaester Lyonce. He proved more robust than his predecessor, serving the realm until 12 AC, when he slipped in the mud and broke his hip, dying soon after. Whereupon, the current Grand Maester, Grand Maester Garwin, was elevated to the position. As we have discussed, the institution of the King's Small Council did not come into its full effect until the reign of Aegon's grandson, King Jaehaerys the Conciliator. But that's not to suggest that Aegon ruled without the benefit of counsel. He is known to have consulted, often with his various Grand Maesters, and his own household maester as well, on matters relating to taxation, debt, and income. He also created other roles, such as the Master of Coin, in charge of all the taxation and economic policy of Westeros. Though Aegon kept a septon at King's Landing, and another at Dragonstone, the king more often than not wrote directly to the High Septon of Oldtown on religious issues, and always made a point of visiting the Starry Sept during his royal progresses. More than any of these, King Aegon relied most upon the king's hand, and of course upon his sisters, his wives, the queens Rhaenys and Visenya, queens who held more power and influence than any to come after them, save for maybe good Queen Alysanne. A common misunderstanding is the role of the septon at the king's court. Contrary to popular belief, they are not in fact an official member of the small council, and more often than not would advise the king and the other lords at court personally regarding spiritual matters of the faith. However, there are many instances we know of where the court septon was included and given a seat on the small council in an advisory role. Under King Aegon I, however, we cannot say if any septons did so on these proto-small councils. There are of course exceptions to this rule, however. Many of the septons would often in fact be given roles within the small council, with two in particular, Septon Mermerson and later Septon Bath, who would both serve as hand of the king. In fact, Bath was more than just an advisor to King Jaehaerys, but a close personal friend. It is fair to say, all the good work Jaehaerys the Conciliator would do over his long reign would not have been possible without Septon Bath. So while most septons are not officially members of the small council, we cannot understate how important their role is at court and the influence they held. We see a lot less septons as close advisors to the Targaryen kings after the building of the Great Sept of Baelor during the reign of King Baelor the Blessed from 161 to 171 AC. With the High Septon moving from Oldtown to King's Landing, with the king now able to go straight to the High Septon for advice and wisdom when it came to matters of the faith, thus reducing the importance of the court septon. Rhaenys, the youngest of the 3 Targaryens, was all her sister was not. Playful, curious, impulsive, given to flights of fancy. No true warrior, Rhaenys loved music, dancing and poetry, and supported many singers, mummers, and puppeteers. Yet it was said Rhaenys spent more time on Dragonback than her brother and sister combined, for above all, she loved to fly. Fire and Blood, Aegon's Conquest. Technically speaking, officially, there has never been a ruling queen of the Seven Kingdoms of Westeros. There are some women who pushed claims, some who were passed over, and some who fought wars for their rights, but still ended up defeated. But when we are looking at the list of official monarchs of the Seven Kingdoms, there has only ever been kings. Most women who had the title of queen did so as a consort to the ruling king. Strictly speaking, this is the case with the two sister wives of Aegon the Conqueror, Visenya and Rhaenys Targaryen. But both Visenya and Rhaenys were so much more than your average queen consorts. In many ways, they were almost equal partners in the conquest and rule of Westeros. These two women were trusted by Aegon implicitly, and given more freedom to rule than any other queen Westeros has ever seen, save for maybe good Queen Alysanne, whom too had a significant influence, and the heir of her brother and king, Jaehaerys the Conciliator. Visenya and Rhaenys were part of council meetings. They held their own courts in the king's place, and gave judgment over issues brought to them. They even had enough influence and respect from Aegon to negotiate political matters and suggest changes and additions to law. Aegon, Visenya and Rhaenys are known in the history books as the three heads of the dragon, because this very much reflects the personal and working relationship they had. It was said by some, Aegon wed Visenya out of duty and Rhaenys out of desire and love. Fire and Blood, Aegon's Conquest. It's often said that Queen Rhaenys was a great patron to bards, singers, mummers and puppeteers of the Seven Kingdoms, showering them with gold and gifts on those who pleased her. The early days after the conquest, in the smoky hall of the Aegon fort, there was always the hum of some tune or ballad. Her sister Visenya did not share her younger sibling's love of the arts. In fact, she is said to have found Rhaenys' patronage frivolous and a waste of gold. But Rhaenys correctly saw that there was wisdom in the power of music and poetry that went beyond a simple love of art. It could indeed be a vital political tool if used correctly. A tool, if not used by House Targaryen, could just as easily be used by their foes against them. In the early years of Aegon's reign, the singers and bards proved more than eager and willing to win the favour of Queen Rhaenys, and composed many songs and tunes in praise of House Targaryen and King Aegon himself. In time, these songs passed from singer to singer, and went forth into the world as they were performed and sang in every keep, castle, village green, tavern, brothel and campfire in the Seven Kingdoms, from the most southern part of House Targaryen's dominion in the Dornish marches to the cold and bleak wall in the distant north. Thus, tales of Aegon, Visenya and Rhaenys would become legend, and the three heads of the dragon beloved by even the most simple of small folk in the most isolated part of the kingdom. Aegon was no longer just the Conqueror, but Aegon the Dragon, the hero king of Westeros, whom sat upon his iron throne bringing peace and justice to all. When Queen Visenya placed a Valyrian steel circlet studded with rubies on her brother's head, and Queen Rhaenys held him as Aegon, first of his name, king of all of Westeros and shield of his people, the dragons roared and the lords and knights sent up a cheer. Fire and Blood, Aegon's Conquest. Out of the three heads of the dragon, it seems Rhaenys was the most beloved by the small folk, and if accounts from this time are to be believed, she too loved and took great interest in them. She was known to have had a special love for the women and children of the realm. There was one occasion when Aegon and Visenya were on a royal progress that Rhaenys was left to sit the Iron Throne and rule the realm in her brother's place. One day, she was holding court in the Aegon fort's cavernous throne room, thick with smoke from the fires. A man was brought before her, accused of beating his young wife to death. The brothers of the woman wanted him to be punished for his crimes, but the husband argued that it was his lawful right to beat and kill his wife, as he had discovered her in bed with another man. Lawfully speaking, the husband had the right of it. The law in most of the Seven Kingdoms before the conquest was well established, with the exception of Dorne, who had always been well ahead of its neighbours when it came to the rights of women. By law, this husband did have the right to chastise his erring wife. The husband also pointed out that the iron rod he had used to beat his wife was no thicker than his thumb, which was too clearly defined by ancient laws. He even went as far as bringing the very rod in question to court with him as proof. But no ancient law, however, was going to satisfy Rhaenys Targaryen. She'd asked the man coldly how many times he had indeed struck his wife, but the husband could not find an answer. The dead woman's brothers claimed, however, it was at least 100 blows. Queen Rhaenys took some time to consult with her maester, then a septon, before rendering her judgment. As an adulterous wife gave offence to the seven who created women to be faithful and obedient to their husbands, and therefore should be chastised. For a brief moment, it is said the husband had believed he had won the argument. But Rhaenys continued. She decreed that as God had 7 faces, the punishment should only consist of 6 blows, with the 7th reserved only for the stranger, as the stranger is the face of death. Therefore, the first 6 blows had been technically lawful, but the other 94 had been an affront to gods and men, and must be in turn punished in kind. From that day on, the rule of 6 became a part of Westerosi common law, next to the rule of thumb, which established the legal width of a rod that can be used to beat the wanton wife. The accused husband was taken away from the Aegon fort to the foot of the hill of Rhaenys, where the dead wife's brothers dispensed 94 blows using a rod of lawful size. Some say even the very same rod he'd used to beat his wife. Strangely, this tale does not say if this husband survived his punishment. While Rhaenys' rule of 6 was not as progressive as, say, in Dorne, it was a huge step forward for the rights of women in Westeros. Some do question, given Rhaenys' apparent love for women, why she did not outlaw the chastisement of wanton wives and women altogether. The truth is, during these early days of Aegon's rule of Westeros, each kingdom was still very much seen as individual. Uprooting the very foundation of these ancient laws would have likely have caused much resentment from the men in power across the realm, resentment that could fuel uprising. Even half a decade later, when Queen Alysanne convinced King Jaehaerys to repeal the right to the first night, an ancient tradition that allowed a lord to claim the first night of a bride at their wedding, it was met with much hostility and resentment, especially in the north, where this tradition was most popular. The difference is, by this time Westeros itself was much more stable, and House Targaryen's power not even remotely in question. Thus they were able to make this huge change to the rights of lords. The Rule of 6 was a compromise of Rhaenys' goals, but a necessary one that created the first step on future improvements to the rights of women in Westeros. It paved the way for the good work of women such as good Queen Alysanne. It is believed this is only one such tale of many similar tales like this, where Rhaenys fundamentally changed the way law was dispensed in Westeros, slowly and gradually improving the rights of the small folk, and especially women, throughout her whole life. You're a fool and a weakling, nephew. Do you think any man would have ever dared speak so to your father? You have a dragon. Use him. Fly to Old Town and make this starry sept another Harrenhal, or give me leave. Let me roast this pious fool for you. Visenya to Aenys Targaryen, fire and blood, the sons of the dragon. As it is well known to anyone who spent any time studying the lives of the 3 conquerors of Westeros, Queens Visenya and Rhaenys both had a huge impact in the melding together of this new 7 kingdoms. While Rhaenys took to bettering the lives of women and children and making marriage pacts, Queen Visenya used her power and influence in a very different way than her sister. She was given the same power and freedom by Aegon as her younger sister Rhaenys, but the way Visenya would wield that power, the manner in which she did so, does highlight how different Aegon's 2 queens really were. For example, Visenya did not share Rhaenys' love of music and song. In fact, she saw the gifts of gold and patronages Rhaenys gave bards and singers frivolous and a waste of money. But Visenya did still have a sense of humour, albeit much darker than her siblings. For many years she kept her own fool, a hunchback she called Lord Monkeyface, whose antics amused her greatly. When he suddenly choked to death on a peach pit, the Queen acquired an ape and dressed it in Lord Monkeyface's clothing. The new one is cleverer, she was wont to say. Even so, there was still this underlying darkness in Visenya Targaryen. To most, especially those who did not know her, she presented this grim and hard face of a warrior, stern, hard, and most of all, unforgiving. She was not a traditional beauty like her sister, but she still had a beauty of her own. It is said it had an edge to it. She too did possess the traditional Targaryen features of silver gold hair and violet eyes that made her otherworldly. She was the eldest of the 3 heads of the dragon, and had always been protective of her younger siblings, even Aegon himself. Ironically, however, she would outlive both of them, but this darkness also manifested a dark reputation in turn that would follow Visenya her whole life, especially as she got older. It is said that when she could no longer wield a sword in her later years, she became a user of the dark art of magic and poisons. Some even suggested she could have even been a kinslayer and a kingslayer, though no proof has ever been offered to support these claims. Your guards are slow and lazy, Visenya Targaryen to King Aegon after cutting his cheek to prove a point. The world of ice and fire, the Targaryen kings, Aegon. The idea of Visenya being a kinslayer or even a kingslayer would be a cruel irony if true, which is why many do not believe most of the more sinister versions of the tales. In her youth, no one did more to protect the king than Visenya. She twice wielded Dark Sister in Aegon's defence when he was set upon by Dornish cutthroats during the First Dornish War. Aegon very well could have died if not for Visenya's intervention. Suspicious, ferocious by nature, she trusted no one but her brother and sister, even those few she would call a friend. During the Dornish Wars, she took to wearing a shirt of mail at night and sleeping with a dagger under her pillow. Even under her court clothes, she was fully armoured and urged the king to do the same. When Aegon refused, Visenya grew furious. Even with black fire in your hand, you are only one man, she told him, and I cannot always be with you. When the king pointed out that he had guardsmen all around him, Visenya drew Dark Sister and slashed him across the cheek so quickly the guards had no time to react. Some reportedly didn't even notice. Your guards are slow and lazy, she said. I could have killed you as easily as I cut you. You require better protection. King Aegon, bleeding, had no choice but to agree. Many kings had champions to defend them, even during the age of the many petty kingdoms of Westeros, prior to the Targaryen conquest. Aegon was the king of 7 kingdoms, more than just a normal king. Therefore, she reasoned he should have 7 champions. Thus did the Kingsguard come into being, a brotherhood of 7 knights, the finest in the realm, cloaked and armoured, all in the purest white, with no other purpose but to defend the king, giving up their own lives for his if need be. Visenya modelled their vows on that of the Night's Watch. Like the black-cloaked crows of the wall, the white swords would serve for life, surrendering all lands, titles and worldly goods, to live a life of chastity and obedience, with no reward but honour. Old Nan said they were the finest swords in all the realm. There were only 7 of them, and they wore white armour and had no wives or children, but lived only to serve the king. Bran knew all their stories. Their names were like music to him. Bran Stark's Thoughts, A Game of Thrones Chapter 8, Bran 2. So many knights came forward to offer themselves as candidates for this first Kingsguard that King Aegon considered holding a great tourney to determine which of them would be the most worthy. But Visenya would not hear of it. To be a Kingsguard knight required more than just simple skill at arms, she pointed out. She would not risk placing men of uncertain loyalty about the king, regardless of how well they performed in a melee. She would choose each of the knights herself. The champions she selected were young and old, tall and short, dark and fair. They came from every corner of the realm. Some were younger sons of lords with little to inherit, others the heirs of ancient houses who would give up their inheritance to serve the king. One was even a hedge knight, another bastard born. All of them were quick, strong, obedient, skilled with a sword and shield, and devoted to King Aegon. These are the names of Aegon VII, as written in the White Book of the Kingsguard: Sir Richard Root, Sir Addison Hill, Bastard of Cornfield, Sir Gregor Good, Sir Griffin Good, his brother, Sir Humphrey the Mummer, and Sir Robin Darkland, called Dark Robin, and Sir Corlys Velaryon, the Lord Commander. History has confirmed that Visenya Targaryen chose these men well. It worked so well, this concept of the Kingsguard has carried on for generations. 2 of her original 7 choices would die protecting the king, and all would serve with valour to the end of their lives. Many brave men have followed in their footsteps since, writing their names in the White Book and donning the white cloak. The Kingsguard now remains synonymous for honour to this day. 16 Targaryens followed Aegon the Conqueror on the Iron Throne before the dynasty was at last toppled in Robert's Rebellion. They numbered amongst them wise men and foolish, cruel men and kind, good men and evil. If the Targaryen kings are considered solely on the basis of their legacies, the laws and institutions and improvements they left behind, the name of King Aegon I, Aegon the Dragon, Aegon the Conqueror, and his sisters belongs at the top of that list. By tradition, he would have been expected to wed only his older sister, Visenya. The inclusion of Rhaenys as a second wife was unusual, though not without precedents. It was said by some that Aegon wed Visenya out of duty and Rhaenys out of desire. Fire and Blood, Aegon's Conquest. As is well known, King Aegon Targaryen married both of his sisters, Rhaenys and Visenya, supposedly Rhaenys for love, Visenya for duty. But these queens were dragon riders, and the blood of old Valyria, with silver gold hair, purple eyes, and the beauty of a true Targaryen. But in most other matters, from personality to politics, the 2 queens were unlike each other as any 2 women could be, save for in one respect. Each queen gave Aegon a single son. The king's eldest son was born in 7 AC to his younger sister Rhaenys. It was said that Prince Aenys was small and somewhat sickly at birth, crying all the time. One maester noted that his limbs seemed especially spindly, his eyes small and watery, and that the other maesters at court feared the boy would not be long for the world. He was also fussy. He refused the breast of several wet nurses and would exclusively feed from his mother, Rhaenys. When it came time to wean the babe, it was said he screamed to the 7 hells for the best part of 2 weeks. So unlike King Aegon was this babe, that few even dared to suggest that Aegon was not the boy's true father, that Aenys was in fact some bastard, born of one of Queen Rhaenys' many handsome favourites, the son of some singer or mummer or mime. But the truth is, there's little to no tangible evidence of this whatsoever, with some of these claims even coming retroactively during the Faith Militant Uprising, decades later, as a way to perhaps discredit Aenys. The biggest concern at court, however, was the slow growth of the prince. It was not until he was given a young dragon hatchling, Quicksilver, born the same year as Aenys, that the prince began to truly thrive. I am descended from Aegon and Rhaenys, through their son Aenys and their grandson Jaehaerys, Daenerys Targaryen to Jorah Mormont, A Clash of Kings Chapter 63, Daenerys 5. Prince Aenys was only 3 years of age when his mother, Queen Rhaenys, and her dragon Meraxes were slain in the skies above the seat of House Ulla, Hellholt, in Dorne during the First Dornish War, thanks to a fluke scorpion bolt hitting Meraxes in the eye. Not only did Rhaenys' death spark the dragon's wrath over Dorne, where thousands of Dornishmen were burned by Aegon and Visenya, but her death also left the boy prince inconsolable. He stopped eating, and even began to crawl, as he had done as a babe. His father despaired of him, and rumours flew about the court that King Aegon might take another wife, as his beloved Rhaenys was dead, and Visenya childless, and perhaps even barren. The king kept his own mind on these matters, however, so no man could say what thoughts he may or may not have entertained. But many great lords and noble knights appeared at court with their maiden daughters, each more beautiful than the last. All the speculation was put to bed in 11 AC, when Queen Visenya suddenly, to the surprise and joy of all, announced she was carrying the king's child, a son, she proclaimed confidently, and so he proved to be. The prince came squalling into the world in 12 AC. No newborn babe was ever more robust and strong as Maegor Targaryen. All the maesters and the midwives agreed. His weight at birth was almost twice that of Aenys. In many ways, even as a babe, Maegor was everything his elder brother was not, for good and ill. Brother, you need never kneel to me again. We shall rule this realm together, you and I. You are more fit to bear this blade than me. Wield it in my service, and I shall be content. King Aenys Targaryen to Maegor, fire and blood, the sons of the dragon. The reality was that the half-brothers were never that close as children. Some like to argue this was due to the age gap, but the reality of it is, it was not really that big of an age gap. The truth is a lot more complicated. Prince Aenys was the heir apparent as his father's eldest son, and thus King Aegon kept him close by his side at all times, to teach his heir the ways of kingship and ruling the kingdom that would one day be his. As the king moved about the realm, from castle to castle on his often long royal progresses, so did Aenys, a shadow at his father's side. All the while, Prince Maegor remained with his mother Visenya, at her side when she held court, while Aegon was away somewhere in the kingdom, as Visenya and Aegon were often apart during these years. When he was not on royal progress, Aegon would return to King's Landing and the smoky Aegon fort, whilst Visenya and Maegor remained on Dragonstone, the seat that both Visenya and Aegon preferred, and very much saw as home. It was for this reason, lords and commons alike began to refer to Maegor as the Prince of Dragonstone to differentiate him from his elder brother. Queen Visenya put a sword in her son's hand when he was only 3 years old. Out of the 3 heads of the dragon, Visenya had always been the keenest warrior. Thus it makes sense her son would follow in that direction. Supposedly, the first thing he did with the blade was butcher one of the castle cats, though more like than not, this tale was devised by his enemies many years later, which is often the case with a lot of the more extreme tales of the early Targaryen Westeros. A game of revisionism. The prince took to swordplay at once, which cannot be denied. For his first master-at-arms, his mother had chosen Sir Gwen Corbray, a deadly knight as could be found in all of the 7 kingdoms, a man who in turn would mould the young prince into an even deadlier warrior. Prince Aenys was so often in his father's company that his own instruction in the chivalric arts, swordplay, and the such, came largely from the knights of Aegon's Kingsguard, and on occasion, sometimes the king himself. Aenys was diligent, all of his instructors agreed, and did not want for courage, always putting all the effort he could muster, which is an admirable trait. But the harsh truth is Aenys Targaryen was never built to be a warrior. He lacked his father's size and strength, and was never more than just an adequate fighter. He could defend himself well enough, even press an attack, but in a real duel or a combat situation with live steel, even an average swordsman would likely have bested the prince. Even when the king pressed Blackfire, the sword of kings, into his hand, as he did from time to time, Aenys could still not improve his limited skills. Aenys would not disgrace himself if found in a battle. His tutors agreed, but no songs would ever be sung of his prowess. But not all men are fighters, and it's apparent that Prince Aenys had gifts that lay elsewhere, skills just as valuable as being a warrior, depending on who you ask. Aenys was a fine singer himself, with a strong, sweet voice. He was courteous and charming, clever without being too bookish. He made friends easily, and young girls seemed to dote on him, be they high-born or low. Aenys loved to ride as well. His father gave him countless horses and desaries, but his most beloved mount of all was his dragon, Quicksilver. The prince was the definition of charm and charisma, both skills that are just as important as swordplay when it came to ruling a kingdom. Some might even argue they were in fact more important. Prince Maegor, on the other hand, rode just as well as his brother, but showed no great love for horses, dogs, or frankly any animal. When he was 8, a palfrey kicked him in the stables. Maegor stabbed the horse to death and slashed half the face off the stable boy who came running to the beast's screams. Or, again, that's what many of the tales told later would say. We can never really attest to their truthfulness or validity. The Prince of Dragonstone had many companions throughout the years, but no true friends. He was a quarrelsome boy, quick to take offence, slow to forgive, and fearsome in his wrath. Not attributes to encourage bonds of friendship and love. His skills with weapons were indeed unmatched, however. He was the exact opposite of his brother in that respect. He became a squire at 8. He was unhorsing boys 4 or 5 years his elder in the lists by the age of 12, and battering seasoned men-at-arms into submission in the castle yard. He became such a skilled warrior on his 13th name day in 25 AC. Queen Visenya bestowed her own Valyrian steel blade dark sister upon her son as recognition of his skill at arms. Aenys and Maegor Targaryen were brothers, both the blood of Aegon the Conqueror, but never had there been two brothers so different from one another in so many aspects, differences that would in time come to define the actions and the legacies in the history of House Targaryen. I saw your father and mother wed as well. Forgive me, but there was no fondness there, and the realm paid dearly for that, my queen. Why did they wed if they did not love each other? Your grandsire commanded it. A wood witch had told him that the prince that was promised would be born of their line. Barristan Selmy to Daenerys Targaryen, A Dance with Dragons, Chapter 23. Daenerys 4. The tradition among the Targaryens, long before the conquest, had always been to marry kin to kin. Wedding a brother to a sister was thought ideal. Failing that, a girl might wed an uncle, a cousin, a nephew, a boy, a cousin, an aunt, or a niece. This practice went back to Old Valyria, where this was common among the ancient families, particularly those who bred and rode dragons, such as the Targaryens. The blood of the dragon must remain pure, the wisdom went. Some of the sorcerer princes also took more than one wife, when it pleased them, though this was less common than incestuous marriage. In terms of House Targaryen, the marriage between Aegon and both of his sisters was uncommon, and spoke to just how different the three heads of the dragon were when compared to their forebearers. In Valyria before the Doom, wise men wrote 1,000 gods were honoured, but none were feared. So few dared to speak against these customs, even if they did think them morally objectable. While House Targaryen kept themselves to themselves on Dragonstone prior to the conquest, most turned a blind eye to their strange Valyrian customs. But after the conquest, being the rulers of the Seven Kingdoms, ordained by the High Septon of the Faith of the Seven himself, many across the realm, and even at Aegon's court, wondered how the issue would be conducted moving forward. Just as Maegor the Cruel once took the swords from the faith, so Jaehaerys the Conciliator deprived us of the scales of judgment. Yet who is truly fit to judge a queen, save the seven above, and the god swarm below? A sacred court of 7 judges shall sit upon this case. The High Sparrow to Cersei Lannister, A Feast for Crows, Chapter 43, Cersei 10. The faith of the Seven was at the centre of power in Westeros, and key in the stability of the new Targaryen rule during these early years. In effect, the power of the faith went unquestioned and in some cases was feared. The old gods were still mostly worshipped in the north, with a few houses keeping the old way south of the neck. The drowned god held sway in the Iron Islands, but the rest of the realm, there was a single god with 7 faces, and his voice on earth was the High Septon of Oldtown, and the doctrine of the faith, handed down through centuries from Andalos itself, condemned the Valyrian marriage customs and practices, the very practices the Targaryens were still using. Incest was denounced as a vile sin, whether between father or daughter, mother and son, or brothers and sisters. However, cousins not so much, but the fruits of these matches were considered abominations in the sights of gods and men. With hindsight, it can clearly be seen that conflict between the faith and House Targaryen was all but inevitable. Indeed, many amongst the most devout had expected the High Septon to speak out against Aegon and his sisters during the conquest, and were most shocked and displeased when the father of all the faithful instead counselled Lord Hightower against opposing the dragons, and even blessed and anointed Aegon at his second coronation. But what choice did he have when faced with the fiery doom of a dragon? Familiarity is the father of acceptance, it is said. The High Septon who had crowned Aegon the Conqueror remained the shepherd of the faithful until his death in 11 AC, by which time the realm had grown accustomed to the notion of a king with two queens, who were both wives and sisters. King Aegon always took care to honour the faith, confirming its traditional rights and privileges, exempting its wealth and property from taxation, and affirming that septons, septors, and the other servants of the Seven, accused of wrongdoing, could only be tried by the faith's own court. The accord between the faith and the Iron Throne continued all through Aegon's reign, from 11 AC to 37 AC. 6 High Septons wore the Crystal Crown. Aegon remained on good terms with each of them, calling it the Starry Sept in Old Town every time he visited the region. Yet, the question of incestuous marriage remained, simmering below like a vile poison. While the High Septons of King Aegon's reign never spoke out against the king's marriages to his sisters, neither did they actually declare it to be lawful. The humbler members of the faith, village septons, holy sisters, begging brothers, poor fellows, still believed it sinful for brother to lie with sister, or a man to take multiple wives. There was a clear divide between the two, and the issue would eventually explode. But for now, at least as Aegon the Conqueror had fathered no daughters, these matters would not come to a head at once. The sons of the dragon had no sisters to marry, so each of them was forced to seek marriages elsewhere. She's mad. Does she think to frighten me? I did not fear the wrath of Maegor the Cruel. Should I fear hers? Rhaegar Baratheon on Rhaena Targaryen. Fire and Blood. Jaehaerys and Alysanne. Their triumphs and tragedies. Prince Aenys, as the eldest of Aegon's children, was the first to marry in 22 AC. He wed Lady Alyssa Velaryon, the maiden daughter of the Lords of the Tide, Aethan Velaryon, the King's Lord Admiral and Master of Ships. She was 15 years of age, the same as the prince, and shared his silvery hair and purple eyes as well, for the Velaryons were an ancient family who too descended from Valyrian stock. King Aegon's own mother had been a Velaryon, so the marriage was reckoned to be one akin to cousin, and thus there was no objection to the match. It soon proved to be happy and fruitful. The following year Alyssa gave birth to a daughter. Prince Aenys named her Rhaena, in honour of his mother. Like her father, the girl was small at birth, but unlike him she proved to be happy and a healthy child, with lively lilac eyes and hair that shone like beaten silver. It was written that King Aegon himself, a man of great control and sternness, wept the first time his granddaughter was placed in his arms, and thereafter he doted upon the child. Some believe this is in some part because she reminded him of his lost queen, Rhaenys, in whose memory she had been named. As the news of Rhaena's birth spread, the realm rejoiced, save perhaps for Queen Visenya. Prince Aenys was the unquestioned heir to the Iron Throne, all agreed. But now an issue arose as to whether Prince Maegor remained second in the line of succession, or should be considered to have fallen to third behind this newborn princess. Queen Visenya proposed to settle the matter by betrothing the infant Rhaena to Maegor, who had just turned 11. But Aenys and Alyssa spoke against the match, and when word reached the Starry Sept, the High Septon sent a raven, warning the king that such a marriage would not be looked upon with favour by the faith. His High Holiness proposed a different bride for Maegor, his own niece, Cerys Hightower, maiden daughter of the Lord of Old Town, Manfred Hightower. King Aegon, mindful of the advantages of closer ties with Old Town and its ruling house, saw wisdom in the choice, and agreed the match. But many do believe he did fear somewhat the reaction of the faith if he did wed his son to his granddaughter. Thus it came to pass in 25 AC, Maegor Targaryen, Prince of Dragonstone, wed Lady Cerys Hightower in the Starry Sept of Old Town, with the High Septon himself performing the nuptials. Maegor was 13 years of age, his bride 10 years his senior, but the lords who bore witness to the bedding all agreed the prince made a lusty husband, and Maegor himself boasted that he had consummated the marriage 12 times that night. He was quoted as saying, "I made a son for House Targaryen last night," as he broke his fast the next morning. The son indeed did come next year, but the boy, named Aegon, after his grandsire, was born to Lady Alyssa and fathered by Prince Aenys. Once again, celebrations swept the Seven Kingdoms. The little prince was robust and fierce, and had a warrior's look about him, declared his grandfather, Aegon the Dragon himself. Whilst many still debated whether Prince Maegor or his niece Rhaena should have precedence in the order of succession, it now seemed beyond question Aegon would follow his father Aenys, as Aenys had followed Aegon. But the matter of succession order would become an issue that would plague House Targaryen for the better part of the next 150 years, and some would argue, even longer. You are fearless when facing a girl on a horse, I see. The next time I come, I will be on a dragon. Throw dirt on me then, I pray you. Rhaena Targaryen to the poor fellows. Fire and blood, the sons of the dragon. After the birth of Prince Aegon, born to the Conqueror's heir Aenys Targaryen and his wife Alyssa Velaryon in 26 AC, came a plethora of other children, one after the other, and with that the Crown Prince had secured House Targaryen's line of succession and ensured the legacy the Conqueror had built would remain for decades to come. All of this, of course, came as a delight to the children's grandfather, King Aegon, if not necessarily that of Queen Visenya, who found her own son's position falling rapidly. In 29 AC, Aenys and Alyssa had a second son they named Viserys. Viserys being the male denomination of Visenya, which some suspect was meant to honour Aenys' aunt, Queen Visenya, or at least that's what some versions of the tales say. A few years later, in 34 AC, came a third son, as Alyssa gave birth to Jaehaerys, her fourth child in total. Only 2 years later, in 36 AC, came another daughter, Alysanne. Princess Rhaena was 13 years old when her younger sister was born, but Grand Maester Garwin notes in his court records that the girl delighted so in the babe that one might think she was the mother herself. She seemed to have bonded with the babe in a way she never did with her brothers. Rhaena, the eldest daughter of Aenys and Alyssa, was always said to be a shy, dreamy child who seemed to be more comfortable with her animals than other children. She had few friends. As a little girl, she would often hide behind her mother's skirt or cling to her father's leg in the presence of strangers, and even some courtiers she disliked. But she loved to feed the castle cats, and always had a puppy or two in her bed with her, though her mother provided her with a succession of suitable companions and ladies to keep her company, the daughters of lords great and small. Rhaena never seemed to warm to any of them, preferring the company of a book. It may well be that dragons somehow sense and echo the moods of their riders, for Dreamfire came down out of the clouds like a raging storm that day. The writings are set to embark on Dreamfire, fire and blood, birth, death, and betrayal under King Jaehaerys I. Rhaena very much changed when she was 9 years of age. She was presented with a hatchling from the dark and smoky pits of Dragonstone. Rhaena and the small dragon she named Dreamfire bonded almost instantly. With her dragon beside her, the princess slowly began to grow out of her shyness, and in truth became a force in her own right. At the age of 12, she took to the skies for the first time, and thereafter, though she remained a quiet girl, no one dared to call her timid again. It was not long after her first flight on Dreamfire that Rhaena made what you would call her first true friend, her cousin, Larissa Velaryon. For a while, the two girls were all but inseparable, spending every minute of the day together, apart from the few moments Rhaena mounted Dreamfire for a flight around Blackwater Bay or to various locations around the Crown Lands. But that was until Larissa was suddenly and unceremoniously recalled back to Driftmark, as she was to be married off to the second son of the Evenstar of Tarth. This hurt Rhaena greatly, but the young, and in this case especially Rhaena Targaryen, are nothing if not resilient, as the troubles of her adult life would later prove. But the princess soon found a new companion in the hand of the king's young daughter, Samantha Stokeworth. There are some legends that say that it was Rhaena Targaryen who put a dragon egg in the cradle of Princess Alysanne when she was still a babe, as she had done so 2 years prior with her younger brother Jaehaerys, starting a tradition of Targaryen babes being given cradle eggs at birth in the hopes of the eggs hatching and the prince or princess growing with their dragon. If this tale is true, then from those eggs came the mighty dragons Silverwing and Vermithor, 2 dragons who would permanently be etched at large in the history of Westeros, so large in fact they would overshadow so many others. A true king, blood of Aegon the Conqueror, who was my brother, my husband, and my love. If any man questions my son's right to the Iron Throne, let him prove his claim with his body. Queen Visenya Targaryen on her son Maegor, Fire and Blood, the sons of the dragon. Princess Rhaenyra's love for her siblings and the realm's joy at each new Targaryen princeling was not shared by Prince Maegor or his mother, Queen Visenya, for each newborn son to Aenys pushed Maegor farther down the line of succession to almost irrelevancy, and there were still those who claimed he stood behind Aenys' daughter too. For Maegor to have any claim on the Iron Throne would take a monumental event and tragedy to befall many. All the while his brother was fathering several children, Maegor himself remained childless, for his wife, Lady Cerys Hightower, did not fall with child in the years that followed their marriage, despite Maegor's lusty beginnings. But, on tourney ground and battlefield however, Prince Maegor's accomplishments far exceeded those of his brother Prince Aenys. In the Great Tornid River Run in 28 AC, Maegor unhorsed 3 knights of the Kingsguard in successive tilts, before falling to the eventual champion. In the melee, no man could stand before him, and Dark Sister, the blade gifted to him by his mother on his 13th name day. Afterwards, he was knighted on the field by his father, who dubbed him with no less than a blade than Blackfire, the very sword of kings. At only the age of 16, Maegor became the youngest knight in the 7 Kingdoms in living memory. There was no nepotism involved here, as some detractors retroactively tried to claim. Maegor truly did prove himself a skilled and technically gifted warrior, deserving of his acclaim and accomplishments. Other noteworthy feats followed, one after the other. In 29 AC and again in 30, Maegor accompanied Ormond Strong in Aethon Velaryon to the island chain of the Stepstones to root out the Lycian pirate king Sargos Osan, and fought in several bloody battles, showing himself to be both fearless and deadly. In 31 AC, of his own volition he hunted down and slew a notorious robber knight in the Riverlands, the so-called Giant of the Trident. Balerion is a willful beast, and not one to be trifled with. Jaehaerys Targaryen, to his small council, on Balerion the Black Dread, Fire and Blood, Jaehaerys and Alysanne, their triumphs and tragedies. Oddly, however, despite all of his accomplishments, Maegor was not yet a dragon rider. More than a dozen hatchlings had been born amongst the fires of Dragonstone in the later years of Aegon's reign, and were offered to the prince. Yet, he refused them all, even when his young niece Rhaena, in only her 12th year, took to the skies to stride Dreamfire. Maegor still did not claim a hatchling. Maegor's apparent failure became talk of King's Landing, and he was mocked when compared to his niece. Lady Alyssa teased him about it one day in court, wondering aloud in the presence of many courtiers why my good brother is afraid of dragons. With that, Prince Maegor darkened in rage at the jape, because the truth was, Maegor had rejected the hatchlings for a very specific reason. In response to his sister-in-law, he replied coolly that there was only one dragon worthy of him. He did not name that dragon, but all knew which one he meant. His father's, Balerion the Black Dread. Aegon the Conqueror brought fire and blood to Westeros, but afterward he gave them peace, prosperity, and justice. Daenerys Targaryen to her supporters, A Storm of Swords, Chapter 71, Daenerys 6. The last 7 years of the reign of Aegon the Conqueror were peaceful ones when compared with the bloodshed of his early rule. After the frustration of his Dornish War, the king accepted the continued independence of Dorne and flew to Sunspear on Balerion the Black Dread on the 10th anniversary of the peace accords to celebrate a feast of friendship with Princess Daria Martell, the reigning princess of Dorne, the very same princess whom had travelled to King's Landing as her late father's envoy to negotiate the peace. Prince Aenys, now a man of 23 with children of his own, accompanied him on his beloved dragon Quicksilver. Ever since his mother, Queen Rhaenys' death in 10 AC, Aenys had been his father's constant shadow, learning how to rule the kingdom that would one day be his. The king's second son, with his other sister wife Visenya, Prince Maegor, remained on Dragonstone with his mother, shadowing her in a similar way Aenys did his father. Aegon had made the Seven Kingdoms almost one, with fire and blood, but after celebrating his 60th name day in 33 AC, he turned his attention now to brick and mortar and improving the ever-growing city of King's Landing, the capital of his kingdom. Half of every year was given over to royal progresses around the Seven Kingdoms, but now it was Prince Aenys and his lady wife Alyssa who journeyed from castle to castle, from keep to keep, from inn to inn, so the lords and the small folk alike could build a relationship with their future king. All the while, the aging King Aegon remained at home, dividing his days between Dragonstone and King's Landing, spending time with Maegor and his grandchildren, Rhaena, Aegon, Viserys, Jaehaerys and Alysanne. The small fishing village where Aegon and his sisters had first landed had now grown into a sprawling, stinking city of 100,000 people. Only Old Town and Lannisport were bigger. The sheer speed of the growth of King's Landing was unheard of, but this came with its own list of issues. In many ways, King's Landing was little more than an army camp that had swollen to this grotesque size. Dirty, reeking, unplanned, impermanent, and the Aegon Fort, which had been the seat of House Targaryen for the last 33 years, had spread halfway down Aegon's high hill by this time. It was an ugly castle as any in the Seven Kingdoms, a great confusion of wood and earth and brick that had long outgrown the old log palisades that were its only walls. It is said even courtiers and even some princes and princesses had lost their way inside the sprawling maze of the old Aegon Fort. One thing was certain, however. The Aegon Fort was certainly no fit seat for a High King of Westeros, and all those that would follow him on the Iron Throne. In 35 AC, Aegon moved with his now sizable court back to Dragonstone. Dragonstone had not been this busy since the days of the build-up to the landing nearly 40 years ago. Aegon gave orders that the Aegon Fort be torn down, so a new, proper and planned castle might be raised in its place. This time, he decreed he would build it of stone. To oversee the design and construction of this new castle, he named the King's Hand Lord Alan Stokeworth, and his wife, Queen Visenya. There was a joke amongst the small folk that spread to the court as well, that King Aegon had given Visenya charge of building the Red Keep, so he would not have to endure her presence on Dragonstone. King Aegon I Targaryen, Aegon the Dragon, Aegon the Conqueror, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar and the First Men, King of the Seven Kingdoms, died of what Maces believe was a stroke on Dragonstone in the 37th year after the conquest, at the age of 64. If the tales are to be believed, his grandsons were with him at his death in the chamber at the painted table. The king was showing them the details of his conquest, telling them tales of the battles fought and of their late beloved grandmother, Queen Rhaenys. King Aegon's second son, Prince Maegor, was in residence at Dragonstone at the time, as King Aenys was half the realm away in Highgarden, led much of the preparation for the king's funeral. It was Maegor who spoke the eulogy, as his father's body was laid upon his funeral pyre in the castle yard. It is said the words spoken by the young prince were powerful and inspiring, and would surely have made his father proud. The king was clad in battle armour, the very same he had worn during the conquest, his mailed hands folded over the hilt of Blackfire, the legendary Valyrian steel blade of House Targaryen that had been passed down from lord to lord since before the Doom of Valyria. Since the days of Old Valyria, it had ever been the custom of House Targaryen to burn their dead rather than consigning their remains to the ground, which was the norm in both First Men and some Andal customs. Queen Visenya's dragon Rhaegar supplied the flame to light the fire, as Aegon's Balerion the Black Dread was too large to fit into the yard of Dragonstone. Black fire was burned with the king, but as the fire burnt down, it was retrieved by Prince Maegor. Its blade was now noticeably darker than it was before, but elsewise was unharmed. No common fire can damage Valyrian steel. In a way, the new hue of the blade suited its name much better. Aegon was survived by his sister wife, Visenya, his sons, Aenys and Maegor, and his 5 grandchildren, Rhaena, Aegon, Viserys, Jaehaerys, and Alysanne. Prince Aenys was 30 years of age at his father's death, Prince Maegor 25. Aenys had been at Highgarden on his royal progress when Aegon had died, but Quicksilver returned him to Dragonstone in time for the funeral, even if he could not be involved in the planning of it itself. Afterward, he donned his father's iron and ruby crown, and Grand Maester Garwin proclaimed him Aenys of House Targaryen, the first of his name, King of the Andals and the Rhoynar and the First Men, Lord of the 7 Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm. The lords who had come to Dragonstone to bid farewell to their king knelt and bowed their heads. When Prince Maegor's turn came, Aenys drew him back to his feet, kissed his cheek, and said, "Brother, you need never kneel to me again. We shall rule this realm together, you and I." The king then presented his father's sword, Blackfire, to his brother, still warm from the funeral pyre, saying, "You are more fit to bear this blade than me. Wield it in my service, and I shall be content." Some may have seen this as an honourable gesture by Aenys to his younger brother. Others, the first mistake of many Aenys would make during his reign, and a sign for things to come. This bequest would in fact prove to be most unwise, as later events would clearly demonstrate. Since Queen Visenya had previously gifted her son with Dark Sister, Prince Maegor now possessed both the ancestral Valyrian steel swords of House Targaryen. From this date forward, however, he would only wield Blackfire, the Sword of Kings, whilst Dark Sister hung on the wall of his chambers on Dragonstone. After the funeral rites had been completed, the new king and his entourage sailed to King's Landing, where the Iron Throne stood amidst the mounds of rubble and mud that was once the Aegon Fort, which had now been torn down, and pits and tunnels and pot marks across the hill were all that remained, where the cellars and foundations of this new Red Keep were to be dug. The new castle had not yet begun to rise. Nonetheless, thousands came to cheer King Aenys as he claimed his father's seat as his own.